There is a nonprofit group which has been delivering hope to many around the world for a very long time. It is Mission Aviation Fellowship, a Christian organization that uses airplanes to bring the love of God in tangible ways to thousands of isolated communities around the globe. Joining me now is the CEO of Mission Aviation Fellowship, Brad Bell, joining me from Guelph, Ontario. Welcome to Bridge City News, Brad.
Thank you, Hal. Good to see you again.
You too. Now, how would you best explain what Mission Aviation Fellowship is all about in a more specific way?
Yeah, so you mentioned our mission statement, sharing God's love through aviation and technology. We're in about 30 countries, and we use our aircraft to deliver medical and food aid. And those same aircraft also transport local pastors and evangelists and doctors. So the work is quite varied between each country, but that's typically what we do. One of the main things I think that makes us different from some other agencies is that our mission staff live in the countries with the people that they serve. So they're almost all overseas.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, how do you work with some of the volatile areas, especially when some governments may be corrupt, trying to get into those countries. But if you have boots on the ground and locals that you work with, it makes it a little bit easier, I guess, does it? To try and reach the most vulnerable.
It helps, and we've been in the countries typically for decades or many, many decades, and so we've been able to build trust with local officials and government officials, and they understand that we are there to help, and that really helps a lot.
So how and when did your group actually get started with Mission Aviation Fellowship?
So we're pretty old, older than me. This is our 75th anniversary. We started just after World War II, and there was a number of pilots that were really passionate about flying, and they had just served in the war, and they wanted to use airplanes for good. They wanted to use airplanes for God's glory. And so they started simultaneously, actually, in England and the United States. And that grew and grew to us now being, as I mentioned, in over 30 countries. So the elevator pitch that I use is that one of our aircraft is taking off or landing every 4 minutes. So it's pretty busy. Yeah.
Wow. Now, you mentioned just after the Second World War. Where was the actual first flight and who flew it?
So we're kind of proud of that. The first flight was flown by a woman, Betty Green, a young lady at the time, and she flew some Wycliffe Bible translators into a remote camp in Mexico. And I mean, we're just proud of that because it's a neat part of our heritage that a woman was the first flight. And Betty served as a WASP, so she was actually in the U.S. Air Force helping to ferry aircraft into the war zones.
I was reading on your website, Brad, that Mission Aviation Fellowship has made over 52,000 flights, carried around 150,000 passengers, hauled over 5 million kilograms of cargo, and covered 7.2 million kilometers. Who specifically does Mission Aviation Fellowship serve?
Wow, so that's a big question. We fly staff and missionaries for Wycliffe and Samaritan's Purse, Red Cross, World Vision, and about 1,500 other partners. And in many countries, we fly pastors and evangelists from the local church to visit the remote congregations. But we also do medical work in those countries. So in Angola, for example, we do something called a medical safari. And we'll take a plane and a pilot and a team of doctors and nurses, and we'll go out for a week, and we'll stop in remote villages, and the doctors will set up clinics, and they'll do surgeries in just some incredibly remote places. And then the whole group will stay overnight, and they'll get up the next morning and they'll fly on to the next village.
Now, you mentioned Samaritan's Purse. One of the stories we recently had on Bridge City News was how they've set up field hospitals in the Bahamas, helping, with the second wave of COVID-19. So are you doing that as well, flying in some of their doctors and some of their nurses too, to help those most vulnerable?
Yeah, generally not. I mean, Samaritan's Purse has significantly less aircraft, but they have some big aircraft where they can fly in these mobile hospitals. No, the work that we would do with them would be over in Africa, where we're flying smaller teams and smaller aircraft into more remote locations.
So Brad, can you share a specific story or two of the difference that Mission Aviation Fellowship flight has made to those you serve?
Yeah, so a couple stories. Our impact in different countries is unique. We operate differently in each country. So Nepal, for example, you'll recall a few years ago there was a bad earthquake, and our emergency response team arrived in country just a few days after. We set up an office, opened that up, and And we had partners literally lined up out the door, down the stairs, and around the block. And so we were able to work with some amazing organizations to fly in food and building supplies and doctors and engineers to help reconstruct a lot of the villages that have been destroyed. I was in South Sudan about a year ago, actually about a year ago this time, and I was out on a long flight, about an 8-hour flight with one of the Canadian pilots, and we stopped at a number of villages, and we had to refuel, and we were also dropping and picking up people. And one of the teams that we picked up, we stopped in a village, and we picked up a group of men from a U.S. church, and they had been at a remote hospital installing a solar panel system, a high-powered solar panel system. And the weeks prior, we had delivered the team. We'd flown them out. We'd flown out their solar panels. So there's a lot of kerfluffle, and we're getting ready to leave. And the head nurse from the hospital comes out, and she introduced herself, and she said to me, we have a lot of power failures out here. And what these men have done means that I won't have to hold a baby dying in my arms because the power's failed and the oxygen pumps failed. And the baby can no longer survive. And wow, that really hit me. And so, that's some of the impact, along with our partners, that we're able to have in many places in the world.
That definitely touches a lot of people's hearts. Tell me about some of the other rewards you get out of heading up Mission Aviation Fellowship Canada.
Me personally, or the organization?
No, you personally, as a CEO. Talk to me about it.
Wow. Well, I used to be. I started my own technology company at a university, so I did entrepreneurial tech for 26 years. And I was just in an interview earlier today talking about how meaningful this work is, how important it is to be able to have this impact on people's lives, to be able to share the gospel. It has just been incredibly rewarding. And most days I am just honored and humbled and proud to be able to be part of this organization. And because the organization is 75 years old, there's a real sense that I'm really just the current caretaker, that this organization had a tremendous legacy. And so it's just a privilege to be part of that.
That's a wonderful, wonderful attitude to have. Brad, what about some of the major challenges that you have with MAF?
Well, like any other organization, there's lots of complexity to deal with and fundraising and that kind of thing. COVID has been tough. I know it's been hard on everybody. Our field staff, back in March when COVID hit, we didn't really know what that was going to look like. Nobody knew. And our field staff, along with our leadership, made the decision that our staff would stay in the field because they wanted to serve the people that they lived with in case there was a need, in case they were able. And so COVID's been difficult. Some countries, they don't allow us to fly at all. Other countries allow us to fly, but only medical. Some countries we can fly as normal. And so COVID has just brought a myriad of challenges. Some of our staff needed to return home because they have family members that are sick, parents that are aging, and that's been a challenge. And so we've spent a lot of time and energy just coping through that, and God has blessed us through all that. But like other organizations, and I want to be careful, I know this has impacted everybody, so I don't want to make it sound like we're hard done by. We're not. We've been blessed, but it certainly has been a challenge.
So Brad, let me ask you something. Where do you receive a lot of your funding?
So, we're kind of unique. About 97% of our funding comes from private individuals. For a charity our size, that's really weird. Typically, a charity our size would be getting a significant portion of their funding from government or from foundations. And we are just incredibly blessed with a really dedicated group of supporters that have funded us for years and years. So it's a real privilege to be able to represent those donors when we go out and do all that work.
Now, you talk about flying into some of these remote areas, and I'm thinking maybe some of different countries around the world where there might be some of that instability. Do you ever fear for your safety as you're flying into a lot of these regions?
Well, when the CEO goes to visit one of the programs, which I'm privileged to be able to do a couple times a year, I never feel unsafe because I'm with staff that have lived in the country, that know the locals. I want to be careful that I don't sound smug about that because I know there is danger in some of the countries, but I do feel quite well protected. But clearly our staff at some points are in danger, and it's by the grace of God that they're kept safe. And it varies from region to region. We're in a lot of different parts in the world. I think of one country last year where we had to make the difficult call of evacuating all of our staff during the summer because there was danger. So it does vary, but we also operate, or we try and operate in a very safe mode, and we're constantly assessing what we think the risk level is in order to keep our families safe. Because it's not just our pilots and our engineers that are there; our families live there.
So how are Jesus and God brought up in a conversation when you're helping those who are most vulnerable in these different regions? How do you bring up the love of Christ in these conversations as you're helping people?
Well, that looks different in every place that we're serving. Sometimes if we're flying an evangelist or a pastor into a remote village to do a tent meeting, it's pretty clear why we're there. And we're sharing with staff about our Christian life and our Christian values. And other places, it's simply that we're there. It's simply that we're there to do a medevac, to bring a sick patient back. And a lot of what we do, I often say this, it's the work that our pilots and engineers and that they do is amazing, but the work that our spouses do is in some cases almost more. So that they're helping do a homeschool, or they're teaching at a school, or they have a group of people over at their home and every week, and they're just visiting, and they're just living life with these people. And I was in Uganda last year. One of the wives has a street ministry for street kids. And every week she goes and she works with 50 to 100 street kids, and they do reading, and they do singing, and they feed them, and just doing life and just sharing God's love. So, it just looks different everywhere we are.
And I can imagine learning about all the different cultures and foods and languages. That's also quite rewarding as well. How many aircraft do you have? I'm just curious.
About 130.
Wow.
Yeah, so one of the other taglines is we have the world's largest fleet of small aircraft. A lot of those are Caravans and Kodiaks, which would be 10 or 12-seater aircraft. So substantial, I like to call them large little aircraft. So substantial aircraft that can carry a lot. And then, of course, we have some smaller 4-seaters and that kind of thing as well.
How is Mission Aviation Fellowship planning for the future to ensure that your group remains effective and has a big impact in countries around the globe?
That's a big question. So, I'll touch on one area. So one of the areas that we've started to look at in the last 5 years is something called disruptive technology. And disruptive technology, you'd be familiar with that, Uber. Look what Uber's done to the taxi industry, or Airbnb to the hotel industry. And so we're vigilant for technologies that might be disruptive in a harmful way, but could also be disruptive in a positive way. So I'll give you an example. One of those technologies is electric flight. We think there's a lot of promise in electric flight. It has the potential to reduce our costs by almost 100-fold, and that would allow us to do, just incredible. So that would allow us to do more ministry for less dollars. It would allow us to fly people that could never have afforded our services before, and some of the electric flight does vertical takeoff and vertical landing. So we need airstrips. We don't need big airstrips. We don't need fancy airstrips. They can just be grass strips, but we need some form of flat airstrip right now to land. If we could do vertical takeoff and vertical landing, then, we'd be able to reach even more remote locations than we can now.
So outside of airstrips, what are some other key areas where you're asking for prayer when it comes to your ministry?
Yeah, so a couple of areas that come to mind. COVID and the impacts of COVID this year. I don't know about you, but I've been on a lot of calls where people are just tired of COVID. And again, I don't want to sound like I'm whining. We are incredibly blessed, but COVID's been hard, and we have families overseas that were supposed to come home this summer that couldn't. Some of them are feeling isolated. We've had a couple of instances where families have had family members pass away, and they were unable to return home, and that's tragic. So, just prayer for that. It's hard for everybody. And then just our general prayer request is for safety. we do something that's dangerous. We fly aircraft all over the world, and we fly safely, but we never want to take that for granted. And so we just constantly ask for prayer for safety.
Amen. Brad Bell, CEO of Mission Aviation Fellowship, thanks for joining me today from Guelph, Ontario.
Thank you so much for having me on the air. Bye-bye.